In a land that breaks the weak and forges the strong, true belonging is not found within walls, but in the echoes of the blood and the language of the heart. The year was 1883, and the Colorado sun showed no mercy. It bleached the very life from the hills surrounding the Blackwood Mission for foundlings, leaving behind a landscape of dust and rock. For 17-year-old Clara, the adobe walls were not a sanctuary, but a prison of silent desperation. The air hung thick with the ghosts of unspoken sorrows, each day a perfect, gray copy of the one before it. The metronome of their lives was the sharp clap of Matron Gable's hands, a sound that could sour milk and curdle hope. Her charity had long since withered into resentment for the girls in her charge. Clara's only escape was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her mother's delicate sketches of mountain herbs and flora. Each drawing of yarrow, sage, and willow bark was a whisper from a life she barely remembered, a life that had held tenderness. The book was her most guarded secret, a testament to a world beyond the mission's rigid prayer schedules and watery stew. It was a private language, a garden of knowledge cultivated in the barren soil of her existence, a fragile link to a mother she knew only through pressed flowers and elegant script. A shadow fell over the mission, and its name was Silas Kane. He was a man carved from the territory's harshness, his wealth measured in cattle and fences that bit deeper into the land each year. His sprawling ranch bordered the mission and the lands of the Ute people, whom he regarded with a cold, possessive disdain. He wanted their water, their grass, their mountains. Kane's ambition was a palpable force, a storm gathering on the horizon that threatened to swallow everything in its path, including the unwanted orphans of Blackwood. Matron Gable saw Kane not as a threat, but as a benefactor, a man of power to be appeased. "A straight spine and a silent tongue, Clara," she would often hiss, her eyes like chips of flint. "That is a girl's only currency in this world. Mr. Kane values order." The matron's gaze would linger on Clara, whose quiet nature she mistook for defiance. She saw the girl's distant eyes, not as sad, but as insolent. In Clara, the matron saw a silent accusation of her own failed piety, and her resentment festered like a hidden wound. The punishment was born of discovery. Matron Gable found Clara behind the laundry house, her fingers tracing the drawing of a columbine flower instead of mending a torn sheet. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," the matron declared, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Since you are so fond of the wilderness, you will go and gather kindling from the dry arroyo, and you will not return until your arms are full." She pointed toward the hazy line where mission land bled into the disputed territory patrolled by Kane's men. The command was not just a chore, it was a threat. Clara walked, the sun a hot weight on her calico dress. The silence here was different from the mission's oppressive hush. It was a vast, living quiet, humming with the unseen life of the high desert. With every step away from the cold adobe walls, a strange, fragile sense of liberty unfurled within her. She was alone, but for the first time in a long time she was not suffocating. The air, though hot, felt clean in her lungs, a brief respite from the stale atmosphere of pious judgment and constant scrutiny. A sharp crack echoed from the canyon walls, shattering the afternoon stillness. It was not the snap of a dry branch, but the definitive report of a firearm. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Birds scattered from a nearby pinyon pine, their frantic wings the only other sound. The shot had come from the direction of the creek, from the very lands Kane claimed as his own. Every warning from Matron Gable about the dangers of the wilderness screamed at her to turn back, to run toward the grim safety of the mission. Yet, she remained rooted to the spot. The echo of the shot hadn't sounded like a hunter's clean kill. There was a desperate finality to it, a note of violence that spoke of something other than a search for supper. Fear warred with a deeper instinct, a flicker of the same empathy that drew her to the healing plants in her mother's journal. Caution was a garment she had worn her entire life, but for a reason she couldn't name, she pulled at the thread. Taking a slow breath, she moved forward, her worn boots making no sound in the soft dust. She moved with the caution of a doe, staying low behind clusters of sagebrush and juniper. The air tasted of dust and something metallic, like old pennies. As she neared the creek, she saw them. fresh tracks of shod horses dug deep into the earth as if the riders had departed in a hurry. They led away from the creek, back toward the sprawling, unseen expanse of Silas Kane's ranch. A cold knot formed in her stomach. These were not the tracks of Ute ponies. They were the mark of settlers, of Kane's men. Then she saw him. An old man was crumpled near the water's edge, his buckskin leggings stained dark. He was Ute. His long, graying hair was braided with strips of leather, and his face was a noble map of deep lines. He was trying to push himself up, his jaw set in a mask of silent agony, but his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was alone, his bow lying snapped a few feet away. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed against the searing pain and the unforgiving sun. He was a study in profound, dignified suffering. Clara ducked behind a rock, her mind racing. Matron Gable's words echoed in her memory, painting pictures of ruthless men who inhabited these lands. To be found here with a wounded Ute would be a death sentence of a different kind. Reason screamed at her to retreat, to erase her footprints and pretend she had seen nothing. Helping him was an impossible risk. It meant defying not just the matron, but the unwritten, brutal laws of this territory. Laws enforced by men like Silas Kane. But as she looked at the old man, his stoic fight against unconsciousness, she didn't see the abstract danger the matron had described. She saw a human being, wounded and abandoned. She saw the snapped bow, a symbol of his livelihood broken. In that moment, the world of Blackwood Mission, with its cruel rules and cold prayers, dissolved into meaninglessness. There was only the sun, the creek, the quiet suffering of a man, and the unshakable feeling that to walk away would be to lose the last, most vital part of herself. The decision made, a strange calm settled over her. She scrambled down the rocky bank, her movements now sure and purposeful. The old man's eyes flickered open as she approached, wary but too weak to protest. "Be still," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "I mean you no harm." She knelt beside him, her mind flipping through the pages of her mother's journal, searching for the right drawing, the right words. Yarrow, for a bleeding wound. The image was clear in her mind's eye, her mother's script detailing how to prepare it. She found the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant growing in a patch of sun near the creek. Her hands, usually clumsy with a needle and thread, were deft as she crushed the leaves between two smooth stones, mixing them with a few drops of water to create a thick, green poultice. Every action felt guided, as if her mother's hands were moving with her own. She was no longer Clara the orphan. She was the daughter of a healer, and this wild land was not an enemy, but an apothecary. Returning to the old man, she gently cleaned the wound with a strip of her own petticoat dipped in the cool creek water. He watched her, his dark eyes intense and searching, but he did not flinch when she applied the poultice to his leg. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. With another strip of cloth, she bound the poultice tightly, creating a makeshift bandage. She had done it. She had used her mother's knowledge to ease a stranger's suffering. A quiet, fierce pride burned in her chest. He needed shelter. The sun was relentless, and Kane's men could return. "Can you walk?" she asked. He shook his head. Clara scanned the area, her eyes landing on a thick, fallen cottonwood branch. With effort that made her muscles scream, she dragged it over, wedging it under his shoulders to use as a crude support. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they made their way to a shallow cave hidden behind a screen of willows, a place where he could rest, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. For hours, Clara sat by the old man's side in the cool dimness of the cave, periodically dampening his brow with a wet cloth. She felt a strange sense of peace in the quiet companionship, a stark contrast to the lonely crowds of the mission. As dusk began to paint the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, the old man, whose name she learned was Keem, finally stirred. His gaze was clear now, the fever of pain having receded. "You have a healer's hands," he said, his voice raspy but firm. He spoke in clipped, careful English. "Kane's men, they said I was on their land, that the deer I tracked was their property." He gestured to his snapped bow. "This has been the land of my people since the first sunrise. Now a man with a piece of paper from a faraway city claims the mountains themselves." His words were not angry, but filled with a deep, weary sorrow that resonated with the ache in Clara's own heart. She listened, understanding his loss in a way she could not have explained. Keem's eyes fell upon the small leather pouch at Clara's waist, where she kept a few dried herbs and her mother's book. It was the pouch itself that held his attention. On its flap was a small, intricate beadwork pattern, a radiant sunburst, its rays stitched in yellow and orange beads. He reached out a trembling hand. "Where?" he began, his voice catching. "Did you get this?" Clara explained it was her mother's, the only thing she had left of her besides the journal. A look of profound recognition dawned on Keem's face. "The sunburst. It is the mark of my clan, the mark of my own sister." He told her of a woman, years ago, a gifted healer who had loved a surveyor from the east and had followed him, disappearing from their world. "We thought her knowledge was lost to us forever. The song of the plants had gone silent." He looked at Clara, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But the song was not ended. You are her blood. You have brought it back." The moon was high when Clara slipped back into the mission grounds. The air was cold, and her relief was short-lived. A lantern flared to life on the porch. Matron Gable stood there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of thunderous rage. But she was not alone. Leaning against the porch rail, a cruel smile playing on his lips, was Silas Kane. His presence turned the scene from a simple scolding into something far more sinister. He had been waiting for her. "Well, well," Kane said, his voice a low drawl that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "The lost lamb returns. I was just telling the good matron that we had some trouble on my land today. A Ute poacher. He was wounded, but escaped." His eyes, cold as a winter river, bored into Clara, taking in her disheveled dress and the faint, dark stain on the hem. "Funny thing, finding you wandering out there on the same day." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Clara!" Matron Gable's voice was a whip-crack. "Look at the state of you. Filthy. And what is that on your dress?" She didn't wait for an answer. Terrified of displeasing her wealthy patron, she seized on Kane's insinuation. "You were with them, weren't you? Consorting with heathens and thieves. You have brought shame upon this house of God." Her fear of Kane had transformed into a righteous fury directed entirely at Clara. Kane watched, his expression one of detached satisfaction. This was perfect. He could use the girl to justify his aggression against the Ute. Matron Gable grabbed Clara's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You will tell us where he is hiding. You will confess your sin." Clara stood frozen between the matron's venomous righteousness and Kane's cold, calculating malice. She opened her mouth, but no words came. To tell the truth would be to condemn Keem. To lie would be to condemn herself. Her silence was her confession. With a cry of fury, Matron Gable, aided by one of Kane's silent ranch hands, dragged Clara toward the root cellar. The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing a square of suffocating blackness that smelled of damp earth and decay. "Perhaps a night in the darkness will loosen your wicked tongue," the matron shrieked. Clara was shoved inside, stumbling into the cold, oppressive dark. The door slammed shut, and the heavy bolt slid home with a deafening finality. But in that last moment, as she was being dragged away, Clara's eyes had found Sarah, her only friend in the mission, a timid girl who had shared her crust of bread on more than one occasion. Clara's lips formed the words, a desperate, silent plea that was more breath than sound. "Cave. By the falls. He's hurt." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding and terror. It was a secret passed in a fleeting glance, a terrible burden, and a desperate call to action. In the darkness, Clara huddled against the cold stone wall, clutching the beaded medicine pouch to her chest. It was the only proof that the events of the day had been real, that she was more than just an orphan in a cellar. She thought of Keem, alone and wounded. She thought of her mother's journal, left behind in her small dormitory chest. The fear that Matron Gable would find and destroy it was a cold, sharp knot in her stomach. Despair, a familiar companion, began to seep into her bones. Hours later, in the deep silence of the mission night, Sarah slipped from her cot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the image of Clara's desperate face propelled her forward. She knew the risk. If caught, the matron's wrath would be terrible. But she also knew the truth of Clara's kindness and the cruelty of the matron and Cain. With a small bundle of bread and a canteen of water, Sarah crept out of the dormitory window, a small, determined shadow running toward the dark, unknown expanse of the Ute lands. Dawn broke, casting long shadows across the valley. It came not as a sound at first, but as a tremor in the earth, the rhythmic beat of dozens of unshod ponies. A column of Ute riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. They were not a war party. They moved with a solemn, inexorable purpose that brought the mission's morning routine to a halt. The girls in the yard froze, their chores forgotten, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They were led by a tall young warrior who sat on his pony with an air of quiet authority. His face was stern, his dark eyes missing nothing. This was Taeyeon, Kime's son. Beside him rode a small, exhausted figure, Sarah, who had found their hunting camp and delivered her desperate message. They stopped 20 feet from the mission gate, a silent, imposing delegation that brought Matron Gable rushing out, her face pale but her expression defiant. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" the matron demanded, her voice tight. Before Taeyeon could answer, Silas Cain and 2 of his men rode up, having seen the riders from his ranch. "Gable, get back inside," he commanded, positioning his horse between the matron and the Ute. "This is private property. I told you these people were trouble. Now they've come in force. You have no business here," he snarled at Taeyeon. The air crackled with tension, a confrontation of 3 worlds on a small patch of dusty ground. Taeyeon ignored Cain, his gaze fixed on the matron. His English was clear and measured, carrying the weight of the mountains behind him. "We are not here for you, or for him," he said, nodding dismissively at Cain. "We have come for a girl, the one who gave aid to my father when your man left him to die." He looked past the matron at the huddled orphans. "We have come for the one who carries the sign of the sunburst." The matron's face tightened, her lie about to be exposed to the entire world. Summoning a final surge of courage, Sarah stepped forward from behind Taeyeon's pony. "She's in there!" she cried, her voice trembling but clear as she pointed a shaking finger at the cellar door. "The matron locked her in the cellar!" A collective gasp went through the crowd of orphans. All eyes turned to the heavy oak door. Taeyeon dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked to the door and, with a single powerful motion, slid back the heavy iron bolt. Clara emerged, blinking against the sudden, blinding sunlight. She was pale and smudged with dirt, her thin frame trembling slightly. She saw the riders, the furious face of Silas Cain, the stunned disbelief on the matron's face, and finally, the exhausted but triumphant look on Sarah's. Then she saw Taeyeon. He stood before her, his stern expression softening as his eyes fell on the beaded pouch still clutched in her hand. A silent understanding passed between them. "Granddaughter of she who knows plants," Taeyeon said, his voice resonating in the charged silence. The title was not one of prophecy, but of lineage, of fact. "My father Kime sent us. He said a lost part of our family has been found. Your place is no longer here." He was not asking. Matron Gable finally found her voice. "She is nothing," she shrieked, her authority crumbling into dust. "A disobedient, wretched girl, get back inside." But her words had no power. They were the desperate cries of a tyrant whose reign had ended. Clara looked at the matron's face, contorted with hate. She looked at Sarah, offering a small, grateful nod. She looked at Cain, whose plans were now in ruins. Then her eyes met Taeyeon's. In his gaze, she saw not just a rescue, but a future. Slowly, deliberately, she walked past the sputtering matron, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground, and stopped before Taeyeon. She had made her choice. The journey into the heart of the Ute lands was a revelation. Clara rode a gentle mare, with Taeyeon a quiet, reassuring presence at her side. The harsh, threatening landscape she had known transformed into a vibrant tapestry of deep red canyons, soaring mesas, and a sky so vast it felt like a benediction. For the first time, she did not feel like an intruder in the wilderness. She felt like she was a part of it. The wind in the pines no longer whispered of loneliness, but of ancient stories. As they rode, Tayan spoke to her, not of grand destinies, but of her grandmother. He told her stories of the woman's skill with plants, her kindness, and the sorrow of her departure. "Our healers have remembered the old ways," he said, his eyes on the horizon, "but her songs, the ones she sang to the plants to ask for their gifts, were lost. We hoped they would one day return." In his words, Clara began to understand the true weight of her mother's journal. When they arrived at the encampment, nestled in a valley protected by towering cliffs, she was not met as a queen, but as kin. Came, his leg bound but his eyes bright, greeted her with a warmth that melted the last of the ice around her heart. She was given a lodge, simple and clean, and the people of the village would stop by, not to stare, but to offer a quiet smile or a piece of fry bread. They saw not an outsider, but the return of a vital part of their own story. One evening, as the sun set the cliffs ablaze with color, Clara stood with Tayan on a ledge overlooking the valley. The hollow ache she had carried in her chest for as long as she could remember was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. "Cain will not forget this," she said softly. "No," Tayan agreed, his gaze steady. "But you are not alone anymore." He looked at her, and in the space between them, a fragile, hopeful promise began to grow. She was not an orphan. She was home.